And the question that we want to look at today is, what is the Quran and what do Muslims believe about the Quran? As you may or may not know, the Quran is the holy book of the Muslims. And the Muslims believe that it is God's final revelation to humanity, right? The final message that God has sent as a guidance to all of humanity. And Muslims see this as a code of conduct for life. In other words, it is life's manual. This is the view of the Muslims with regard to the Quran. Just as the Christians have the Bible and the Jews have the Torah and Hindus have texts such as the Vedas and the Gita, so on and so forth, the Muslims have this Quran, right? So this Quran, which is seen as the Word of God, right, is seen as this manual of life, and the application of that manual is in the example of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, God's final messenger. So the Muslim is looking at the Quran and also looking to apply it based on the example of God's final messenger, peace and blessings be upon him. Now, the Quran was originally revealed by God to the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, through the intermediary of the angel Gabriel, or what is known as Jibril in Arabic. And this revelation through the angel, and also sometimes directly to the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, sometimes directly to himself, this continued over a period of about 23 to 24 years. And then the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, in turn communicated this message to his people. And this is what was written during his time and what was memorized by many during his time. And what we have in our hands today as the Quran is exactly what was revealed to him. So, as I mentioned, Muslims believe that it is God's final message to humanity, just as a lot of the messengers received books of guidance from God, like Moses received the Torah, Jesus received the Injil or the Gospel, right? And then the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, received the Quran. So this is just a brief statement about the origin of the Quran, so the viewer has a little background. Now, I want to get into a little bit about the style of the Quran. One thing that the reader will notice, especially if you come from a Western background, is that the Quran is not sequential. In other words, it doesn't state that in the beginning such and such a thing happened, and then go in sequential order, and then in the end such and such a thing happened, right? But rather, the verses that are within a particular chapter, they all relate to the overall topic and the overall theme of that chapter, right? So, thus, this makes the Quran more circular in nature rather than sequential and linear in time. So you could be reading a verse from the Quran, talking about, for example, the time of Adam, the first human being, and then a few verses later you could be reading about the Day of Judgment, and maybe a few verses later you could be reading about the time of Abraham, right? But these verses all revolve around a theme of the overall chapter, right? So this is something that the one who reads the Quran must make note of and may not be used to. So that's a little bit about the style. Now, as far as the content, the Quran contains accounts of events from the past, what will happen in the future, lives of the prophets, scientific facts, historical events, and amongst other things. But the basic message and creed that can be found throughout the Quran are things such as the unity of God, His attributes, the hereafter, accountability, punishment and reward, the Day of Judgment, teachings such as attaining piety, fortitude, trusting God, patience, and amongst other noble traits. So although it contains some stories, although it contains events from history, although it contains scientific facts, it's not seen as a book of history or a book of science, but rather the Quran is seen by the Muslim as a total guidance, a revelation from God to humanity. although it does contain these various aspects. Now, the Quran also contains predictions and miracles that could not have been known during the time of the Prophet, peace and blessings be upon him, without that knowledge from God. Now, one of the miracles of the Quran, first and foremost, is the miracle of the Arabic language. And it is the most eloquent book that ever was and ever will be produced in the Arabic language. And the Quran challenged the Arabs at that time to produce something similar to it, to produce something like it. And even the most knowledgeable amongst them, the most eloquent in the language, could not meet that challenge. So when you see non-Muslims criticizing the language of the Quran, know that he is ignorant of the Arabic language. Because even the most eloquent in the language, the most knowledgeable amongst them in the language, could not meet that challenge. Right? Besides this, the Quran, as I mentioned, contains many predictions that could not have been known without knowledge from God. Predictions such as the Roman and Byzantium Empire over the Persians, and the prediction about one of the Prophet's, peace be and blessings be upon him, one of his fiercest enemies, known as Abu Lahab. Descriptions such as the honeybee colony, the non-intermingling of the seas, the expansion of the universe, the shape of the earth, and so on and so forth. And we don't have time to go through all the details in each and every one of these. So I urge the viewer to do his or her own research with regards to this topic to confirm what I'm talking about. Let me give a quote from about the Quran from a scholar. His name is Maurice Bucaille, in his book, The Bible, the Quran, and Science, that kind of relates to what I'm talking about. What he says is, and I'm quoting directly from his book, the above observation makes the hypothesis advanced by those who see Muhammad as the author of the Quran unattainable. How could a man, from being illiterate, become the most important author in terms of literary merits in the whole of Arabic literature? How could he then produce truths of a scientific nature that no other human being could possibly have developed at that time, and all this without once making the slightest error in his pronouncement on the subject? Okay, so now to briefly summarize what we talked about, and to kind of give you the points that I'd like for you to really think about and to take home. The Quran, as I mentioned, according to Muslims, is the final revelation of God to humanity. And He sent God's final messenger as a teacher, as a guide, to convey this message, and as an example, to embody that Quran. Right? So the Quran contains many predictions, many miracles, and that we don't have time to go through all of them, that could not have been known during the time of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. And as I mentioned, I urge the viewer to research this topic and see for his or herself the claims that I'm making. It contains, as I mentioned, facts of history, facts of science, prescriptions to teach humanity noble traits. However, as a whole, Muslims view this as a code of conduct for life and as God's final revelation to humanity. I want to thank you for joining me on this edition of Frequently Asked Questions on Islam. Please join me next time when we look at another one of those questions that is most frequently asked about the Islamic faith, and then give an answer with respect to it. Thank you and goodbye.